Hello, APUSH. You survived. Congratulations. You survived the first lesson in this course, including you 3 a.m. So today we're going to move away from North and South America and talk a little bit more about European society during the Age of Exploration. This is kind of where we set the stage for Columbus sailing across the ocean blue in 1492, even though he had no idea where he was going exactly. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. And I want you to kind of think about this in the following way. If you were a space alien and you decided that you wanted to observe life on Earth in about the year 1400, what you would probably find is that the Chinese were really going places. You would find that the Ottoman Empire, you would find that feudal Japan, you would find the Aztec and Incan empires. They were, kind of impressive, right? Big cities, complicated civilizations and governments. Probably the one place that you would not be impressed with would be Europe. And if you think about it, Europe itself, and by the way, for those of you who have had AP European history, this doesn't get out to Mr. Honeycutt, but Europe is a very unimpressive appendage sticking out of the Eurasian continent, or the Eurasian landmass. There's really nothing exceptional about Europe, unlike most of the other continents that have really large, expansive empires. Europe is this really decentralized, squabbling collection of states. And Europe, by the way, in the 1400s especially, was a Europe that was still the Europe of the Dark Ages. It was a Europe that was still recovering from the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, by the way, had, in about the year 1347 to 1353, it had wiped out anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total population, depending upon where you were exactly. But wait, there's more. Europe was also in the grip of political civil wars, religious civil wars. This was a Europe that was about to go through the very painful and very traumatic Protestant Reformation that would basically forever split the continent in two. And this is also a Europe that is trying to protect itself from this very expansionist and aggressive Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is an Islamic empire, and it was just really kicking butt and taking names. Basically, every European power that it fought, it was able to defeat. So this is a Europe that's not on the cusp of some magical breakthrough, or a Europe that's, going places. This is a Europe that feels besieged. This is a Europe that feels very uncertain of its future. So if that's the case, why is it that we see Europe, almost at random, make this extraordinary discovery? So part of it is because of advances in navigational technology. So the thing is that most of these European countries were very interested in basically expanding their trading relationships with outside powers. One of the interesting things about Europe itself is that Europe is actually resource poor, just to be honest. There aren't very many good commodities in Europe that people want to buy. And by the way, that's kind of been a feature of European history, not a bug of the Middle Ages. So let's say that you are a European of refined tastes. You like the finer things in life. That doesn't mean, by the way, that in the 14 or 1500s you're driving a Ferrari or something. It basically means that you appreciate silks, porcelain, spices. Those are really the hot commodities in Europe during the 14 and 1500s. The problem is that you can't find those things in Europe, at least not naturally. You have to go elsewhere to get them, specifically East and Southern Asia. So the Europeans invest a lot of money and time and effort into researching and designing new types of boats. If you ever see the types of ships that Europeans have been using around coastlines or in the Mediterranean, they really weren't that different from the ships that the ancient Romans and Greeks had used thousands of years beforehand. Basically, they were wooden ships with shallow beams, and they were propelled mostly by rowers. In other words, you get a bunch of people on the boats and they start rowing, which sounds miserable, and that's because it is miserable. And whenever you're traveling from point A to point B, you usually hug the coastline. And the reason you hug the coastline is because, let's say you get blown out to sea. Well, you have no idea where you're going, and not necessarily. Most ancient sailors, especially the Romans and the Greeks, they had to navigate by using the stars, or sometimes just using gut instinct. Imagine your GPS saying "turn right-ish" when you're trying to travel someplace. That's kind of what it feels like to be a navigator before around the 1400s. But then the Portuguese. Portugal, by the way, is a country that's basically to the west of Spain. Portugal has a very energetic and innovative prince named Prince Henry the Navigator, who dumps a lot of money into researching new types of ships and new navigational technology. So the Portuguese introduce, among other things, the compass, cartography. By the way, cartography is basically map making. And they also introduce, with these new ship designs, they introduce ships with beams that go all the way, well, let's say they go deep into the ocean. Because most ocean-going or sea-going vessels at that point, they were kind of flat. And I don't know, if you have like a younger sibling, they might have like a rubber ducky or something. And one of the things you find is that those rubber duckies are kind of flat, right? So you put them on the surface of the water, and if, let's say, you throw something in the water, it might cause the rubber ducky to basically turn upside down. Because if you have a flat-bottomed boat, it doesn't give you a lot of stability. But if you have a bottom that goes deep into the ocean, it gives you a little bit more stability, which is really important when you're talking about the very unstable currents of the Atlantic Ocean, by the way. So really, it's with the Portuguese that you start to see ships like the caravels. These are ships that are designed not to travel along the coastline, but instead they're designed to basically make a beeline for the open sea and to travel without sight of land for days, weeks, and even months in some cases. So Europe, starting with Portugal, starts exploring the high seas with their big fancy new boats. Question is, why don't we see that from other highly advanced civilizations? Like, for example, arguably the most advanced of them all during this time period, China. And the answer is that in some respects, China does actually start to explore overseas, actually in advance of the Europeans. There's this Chinese admiral by the name of Zheng He, who actually explores not just the coastline of basically Southeast Asia and India, but Chinese fleets actually make it all the way um, to basically the Arabian Peninsula, and also the coastline of Eastern Africa. They make it very, very far, and Zheng He actually brings back a ship full of like zoo animals to offer in tribute to the Chinese emperor. But ultimately, the problem for China and other powerful civilizations like China is, why do you need to explore? Um, I'm maybe simplifying a lot of history right here, but China's so wealthy and so powerful that these other overseas civilizations and countries, they don't really have anything that it needs. One of the reasons why Europe is actually first to embrace overseas exploration is because Europe is crappy. Again, Europe is resource poor, and it's also divided into a lot of small competing countries that are trying to basically find some kind of competitive advantage against its rivals. So Europeans have these push factors that are kind of forcing them, or at least encouraging them, to go overseas and capitalize on trade. But if you're China, what does Europe have that you want? You have more technology than they do, more resources. Europeans want your stuff, but you're not really sure if you want their stuff. So what happens is that shortly after Zheng He actually concludes his final mission in 1422, his fleet, which are these massive ships, by the way, they dwarf anything that the Europeans were producing at this time. These massive ships are left to rot in harbor. And there are tons of sort of alternate history stories and novels written based on the idea that China decides to cross the Pacific and colonize the western coast of the United States. Again, it doesn't happen, but there are some historians who argue that if the Chinese got the go-ahead, they certainly could do it if they wanted to. So that's a history of why China doesn't discover North America. Now let's talk a little bit more about the history of the Europeans who do. And by the way, I'm not actually talking about Christopher Columbus, at least not yet. Instead, I'm going to talk about the Vikings. The Vikings are kind of everybody's favorite medieval warriors, besides like the Mongols, right? But the Vikings, they weren't just all berserker gang and battle axes and horned helmets that actually didn't exist. First and foremost, they were explorers. And so if we're talking about people who go out to find new places to trade because of poor resources at home, well, think about the Vikings, who are trying to eke out a living in the northern frontier of Europe, more or less, Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland. Ultimately, explorers from Iceland managed to discover the northern coastline of Canada, near Labrador and Newfoundland. And actually, they leave behind a colony. Now, the thing is that when this is discovered, when the northern coast of Canada is discovered, there are two problems. One is that it's actually hard for that discovery to really make an impact, for news of that discovery to get around. For one, basically the language used by the Norse is runic. In other words, it doesn't use a Latin alphabet. It's very complicated. In fact, we didn't actually know how to read it until a monk in the 1700s actually bothered to try to translate all of these runes. And it took a long time. So one, even if the Vikings had advertised that discovery, nobody could really read it. The second point, though, is that books were super expensive. Anything written down was super expensive because it all had to be transcribed by hand. Before, I hear some of you saying this, the development of the printing press in the 1450s. This is before Johannes Gutenberg manages to develop the printing press. So what happens is that when Columbus discovers North America, or we should say rediscovers America in 1492, word of that invention quickly travels across Europe. But when the Vikings do it hundreds of years beforehand, news of that discovery, not only is it not broadcast, it can't be broadcast. So what happens is that not only is the discovery quickly forgotten by us, because realistically, we don't know, or we never knew of this colony until it was rediscovered in, wait for it, the 1960s. In other words, just 60 years ago. But also the Vikings themselves didn't really remember the fact that they had a colony in northern Canada. And so basically the North America was kind of forgotten about. But what we do see is that the story of colonization, of Europeans kind of looking beyond their borders for resources and goods and commodities, that's something we see hundreds of years before Columbus's actual discovery in 1492. I don't necessarily agree with this next argument, but as a historian, I think you guys should be aware of it because it comes up every now and then. So one argument is that the desire for overseas expansion, for Europeans leaving their homes and colonizing foreign lands, is something that we can trace back to the Crusades. So what happens, of course, in the Crusades is that, and by the way, there are a lot of them, is that during the First Crusade especially, Europeans managed to take control of Palestine, what is called the Holy Land here, and they set up a European kingdom there, basically a European colony, that lasts for, I can't remember how long exactly, but for a generation or two. It's called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, ultimately, that kingdom is destroyed by Muslim counterattacks, but while Europeans are there, what they kind of discover is that, there's some advantages to being in the Middle East. And by the way, it's not just called the Middle for nothing, because being in the Middle East means that you're kind of on this crossroads, right? Goods not only coming into Europe, but you're also seeing goods coming into and out of Asia. So spices, silks, all of those goods that Europeans want. And, before the Crusades, Europeans just didn't have access to those goods. But once they actually managed to taste food that has, that has spices or preservatives, one of the things about human nature is that once we kind of get used to something that's nice, it's kind of hard to get unused or used to not having that thing. So what happens is that even though the Crusades are ultimately a bust for the Europeans, the fact is that the Crusades generate an interest in finding goods from Asia specifically. And it's not a coincidence that, right around the time that the Crusades kind of end, we see this, Marco Polo's expeditions. And of course, those of you, most of you, I think, kind of know that Marco Polo manages to basically travel through Asia. He spends a lot of time in China, and the trip is very, very profitable, but it takes him decades to actually travel from Europe and then travel back to Europe. So, look at this, 1271 to 1295. You might like milk, But if you're going, are you going to spend 14 years going to the store to get some milk? Probably not. Or not, no, not 14 years. 24 years. That's a quarter of a century. So there had to be an easier way to get to Asia. So here's an idea. We talked about Prince Henry the Navigator and the compass and cartography and deep sea ocean going vessels. Why not just use them, right? Makes sense. Well, this is where Washington Irving comes in. Washington Irving is an American author that we'll talk a little bit more about, who kind of creates one of the myths that you probably have already heard, that, well, Europeans didn't do that because Europeans were dumb. They thought the world was flat. And in this kind of cartoonish view of the world, if you actually tried to travel westwards and make it to Asia, you would fall off the edge of the planet, which sounds really rock and roll. But that's kind of the story that Washington Irving, cooks up for us. The thing is that Europeans really didn't think that way. And I'm sure that a lot of you already know that, but believe it or not, any European who had really given the matter some thought knew the world was round. In fact, the Romans and Greeks had figured that out. They basically used trigonometry to prove mathematically that the world had to be round. So it's not necessarily the case that Europeans believed that the world was flat. The issue that Europeans had was this assumption that the Atlantic was basically this huge, vast, endless ocean. And that if you tried to actually travel from Europe to Asia, you would actually exhaust your supplies and starve along the way because it was just endless ocean. So that's kind of the fear. And it was a well-informed fear, actually, because Europeans knew exactly how big the Earth was. What they weren't betting on is that there would be this big land speed bump, also known as North and South America, between the Atlantic and the Pacific. They just assumed that the Atlantic and Pacific were one big continuous ocean all the way to China. And to be honest, if that was the case, they would be right. So Europeans were cautious, not because they were dumb, but actually because they were very smart and had a very sophisticated understanding of Earth's geography. So that being said, the Portuguese especially did take some baby steps. We're not talking at this point about crossing the Atlantic and establishing some colonies in North America. But you do see them cross at least part of the Atlantic and settle subtropical to, actually in some cases, tropical islands called Madeira and the Azores, or the Azores Islands, however you want to pronounce it. I'm not, a student of Portuguese, so just kind of bear with me. But what happens is that the Portuguese colonized those islands, and we see some ominous trends that you're going to see repeat when Europeans arrive in the New World. We see a population of natives that actually come from North Africa, from basically people who are related to the Berbers. And what happens is that the Portuguese try to put them to work. But what happens is that they all die out pretty quickly. And they all die out pretty quickly because the natives haven't really been exposed to all these new diseases that the Portuguese bring with them. Now, the Portuguese understand that these islands are actually pretty lucrative because these are islands that can be used to grow cash crops. Cash crops are crops that can be sold for money. I know that's pretty self-explanatory, right? But it's different than crops that are grown for subsistence, right? You're growing them because you need to eat. These are crops that are grown purely for selling them. And the general rule of thumb, and we'll talk about this a lot throughout this course. A lot of this course, by the way, does revolve around cash crops and where you can grow them. So cash crops in general require warm tropical or subtropical climates to grow. So whether you're talking about sugar or indigo or rice, tobacco, cotton, all of these crops require not just a decent climate, but the right climate. And there aren't very many places in Europe where you can grow those crops. You can on these islands. So the problem is that the Portuguese want to grow these crops, but they don't have, let's say, a native population they can exploit. So what happens, of course, is that because these islands are very close to the coast of Africa, the Portuguese start kidnapping or purchasing African slaves. And specifically, slaves in West Africa. One of the things you kind of see is that when we're talking about the slave trade, which really begins with the Portuguese, we sometimes call this, we'll talk about the Middle Passage specifically in a little bit, this passage between basically West Africa and North America. But what you kind of see is that the Portuguese would go and they would, in some cases, just make landfall and round up West Africans, basically along this stretch of coastline. So, I mean, that's a really big stretch of coastline, as you can see. I mean, that's probably a coastline that's greater in size than the eastern seaboard of the United States. So one of the things that kind of happens is that for West Africans, slavery is kind of this experience that all societies in West Africa share in some respects. One of the other things to kind of mention is that just like there is a ton of diversity between Native American tribes, there's also a lot of diversity between these West African tribes that are being enslaved. And to be honest, it's not really so much that entire tribes are being enslaved. It's that in many cases, the Portuguese are going and purchasing slaves from local leaders and transporting them at first to the Azores and Madeira, and eventually they'll be transported to the New World, to North and South America. So it's only the second day in the course, and we've already introduced something that will dominate so much of our attention for this course. And that is, of course, the story of slavery in North and South America. Now, I want to give some context with what we're talking about here, because part of a historian's job is to not just, recite facts. That's really not a historian's job anyway. But not just to give you guys statistics and facts, but to also talk about the context, right? And so at some point, you have probably heard a statement like this, or if you haven't, you will. And the statement is, well, slavery existed in U.S. history, but before African Americans were enslaved in the United States, Africans were enslaving one another. And I hate to even bring that up, but you're going to hear people who will say that. And it's my job, I feel like, to provide some context for that. So slavery is practiced, or has been practiced, by probably the vast majority of human societies at some point. And so The fact that slavery exists beyond U.S. history is objectively on point. That is an empirical fact. That being said, slavery is a term that can be applied to a lot of different labor systems. Really, if you think about it, in most cases, the term slave is used to describe somebody who is forced to work for another against their will. That being said, there's a spectrum there. And what we kind of see is that the slavery that existed in West Africa, the slavery that existed in the Roman Empire, the slavery that existed in most of the rest of the world outside of North America was very, very different. And not good different, by the way. What you're going to see is that the slavery that develops in North America is extremely different. And in fact, whenever I talk about slavery in U.S. history, very often what we'll do going forward is I'll use the term chattel slavery or New World slavery to distinguish it from Old World slavery. We'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow, but that's probably a good but very depressing way to end for the day. So I will see you guys a little bit later.